Um, my name is Shayok. I'm with Extinction Rebellion. I've been fairly active for about a year now. And I'm involved in various parts of Extinction Rebellion. From like outreach is one of my core interests because I feel we really need to grow the movement. That's the most important thing we need to do. But I do other things as well. Yeah, I just want to start with a land acknowledgement. This is Livingston Manor in Sullivan County, a little north and west of here, and like Manhattan, that's also traditional Lenape land. And as we all know, that they were exterminated and displaced from here. So I would like to acknowledge that they are the original kind of holders and guardians of this land. And what I really like to point out is that not only were they exterminated as individuals, but it was a way of life that was exterminated, right? I heard someone put it in a very beautiful way that we should learn to live in a way where we are skimming the flows of life and not mining the stocks. The way we live now is really like mining the stocks. You use resources and use them and throw them away. And if we were living in accordance with the philosophy of the indigenous way of life, being a part of the ecosystem and not sitting outside it and exploiting it, we would not be where we are today. During this talk, you may feel anxiety and worry. I mean, that's unfortunate, but that's natural. The news is pretty bad. The situation is pretty bad, and I don't really know a soothing way of delivering this news. So if at any point you feel the need to stop and talk about it and process that grief, feel free to say that, and we will do that together. So I have just one slide about the basic science of it. I mean, most of the talk is about politics of climate. So as most of us here probably know, that the Earth relies on the atmosphere. It relies on a greenhouse effect to sustain life. Without the atmosphere, the planet would be extremely cold and extremely hot at some other time. So the atmosphere kind of stabilizes our temperature by heating by holding on to some of the sun's heat, and that's why we have life. But unfortunately, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've been emitting so many of these gases that are called greenhouse gases that now we have an imbalance. We are trapping way much more heat than we are letting out. And the most well-known greenhouse gas is, of course, carbon dioxide. But there are many others which are also very, very important. I like to point out methane particularly, because methane is actually in use all around us. Like most people who live in New York City do their heating and cooking with methane, except that the petroleum industry found a very nice marketing name for it, natural gas, right? But what it is just methane. And methane leaks profusely from these systems. And methane is an 80 times more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And it fortunately degrades after the first 20 years. But now we are in a situation where that first 20 years is very, very important. So it's very important to keep the methane in mind. So methane leaks. Methane is also emitted from all these industrial animal agricultural operations, where the manure of cows and pigs are stored in these gigantic lagoons, and that rots and emits a lot of methane. Then there are others like nitrous oxide, but it's really important to keep methane in mind. And the trouble is, a lot of these methane leaks are not very well accounted for. So that's another source of worry. So we are Extinction Rebellion. It's an important thing to keep in mind that we are a rebellion. We are not tweak the system at the edges kind of an organization. We believe we need a system change for the grave situation we are in, because we are facing extinction. Perhaps not so immediately for us as human beings, but that too like depending on how it unfolds. And we are in the middle of the 6th mass great extinctions. Lots of invertebrates, lots of insects, lots of vertebrates too that we probably don't even know about, that have taken millions of years to evolve in concert with each other. They are vanishing before we even come to know of it. So it is this great extinction that we are rebelling against. Extinction Rebellion got its start in the UK in fall of 2018 and fall of 2019. Those were their big moments. They brought large parts of London to a halt. And that really had a big impact on climate consciousness in the UK and Europe and also in the US. This is from spring of last year. This is a Citibank in the Citibank headquarters in Tribeca. I'm actually somewhere there. So we blockaded their offices. We won't let employees go in. And why did we do that? Because Citibank is the second largest investor in fossil fuel projects. So they have a very important role to play in this extinction. That's from the fall of 2020 outside of City Hall. We were there demanding that the city declare a climate emergency. And you can see all these people that they have locked themselves against each other. And here there's someone who's actually locked their neck to the gate. And just imagine, it's like a pretty serious situation here, right? When the police come and they're going to be like sawing off that thing like inches from your neck with sparks flying. So some of these actions that we do are pretty intense. This is a tripod. This is a technique that lets us hold a fair amount of space for a fair amount of time with small numbers, because the police have to like go to some trouble to get that person down. And so the thing is, like, why do we take such extreme steps? Like, like getting a lock sawed off from inches from your neck, that's like pretty serious. Sitting on top of the tripod for hours is pretty serious, while the police might be sawing the leg off. That's pretty serious. The reason we are doing these extreme things because we have tried everything else. Because people often come up to say, hey, why don't you vote? Why don't you write a letter to the editor? I mean, all those things have been tried and much more. So you can see these like, convention, pact, agreement, all kinds of global summits, scientists and politicians flying across the globe and talking, blah, blah, blah. And what has happened? The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has just kept climbing inexorably. There has been no change in spite of all this talking and conventions, right? So there is no other way. And why has this not brought about change? Because of three reasons: lies, lies, and lies. Our entire system is permeated with lies. Like, even the science is permeated with lies. It's not that the science itself, but how the science gets communicated, how the science gets talked about. So the big Paris Accord of 2015, where nations agreed to keep their to bring their emissions to net zero by 2050. So let me explain what net zero is. So the idea is net zero emissions. So if you emit greenhouse gases, let's say you burn some coal or whatever in one place, and you emit 2 tons of carbon dioxide, then you should have another corresponding place where you absorb those 2 tons of carbon dioxide, let's say through trees or whatever, or oceans. So that's net zero. So nations agreed to try their best to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and this would keep us at 1.5 degrees Celsius below pre-industrial levels. And apparently, this would be a reasonably safe thing to do. But there was a very important qualifier to this statement, a very important detail. This keeps us safely at 1.5 only under a 50-50 probability. Because climate is a very complex system. I mean, overall, it's relatively easy to make like broad predictions, but in the details, like what will be the impact of a certain amount of warming, it's very difficult to predict if the water level will rise by exactly this much, or the effect on agriculture will be exactly that much. So these are very, very complex systems. So this only has a 50-50 chance of being safe. Just imagine. That's just a 50-50 chance. Like, would you get into a plane with a 50-50 chance of survival? Would you cross a street with a 50-50 chance of survival? No, right? So this is the big lie that never gets talked about. And then there are many other lies that are underlying this lie of net zero 2050, all kinds of complex mechanisms to achieve net zero, because we are not stopping to emit carbon dioxide, right? We're still burning fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas, right? So the various creative mechanisms and justifications that they're coming up that we will stay under net zero are like, they're just mind-boggling, that we will capture the carbon dioxide that's coming out of a power plant, bury it under the earth, and all these mechanisms have never commercially succeeded. There have been hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies that have been spent on this. They never had any commercial success. Yet we are coming up with more and more complex and creative mechanisms to sustain this lie. Inflation Reduction Act. It's supposed to be like the greatest climate bill ever, law ever in the United States. That is actually true because the bar is so low. And what was the headline figure for the Inflation Reduction Act? The headline was that we would get a 42% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So this was this report coming out of Princeton, like a well-respected research institute attached to Princeton. But I actually challenged the scientist who leads that project on Twitter, like, what kind of inventory of greenhouse gases are you using? They are using the EPA's inventory of greenhouse gases. And you would think, well, EPA, that's like, seems pretty respectable. But it is well known in the climate field that EPA undercounts methane emissions. Everyone knows that. And he admitted to that. I mean, there is a footnote that says that this is using EPA's inventory. So why is he using that? He said, oh, it's because that's the standard. Everyone knows the EPA thing as a standard. But you know that that standard has something seriously wrong with it, so you should not use it for communicating to the general public, because the general public is not aware of this flaw with this standard. So these are just some of the lies that our system is permeated with. So that brings us to our first demand. Tell the truth. That is Extinction Rebellion's first demand. Tell the truth about the extent of the climate and ecological crisis. Because when you tell the truth, you release energy, release motivation to do something about it. So that's our first demand. I mean, just imagine if the president went to the Rose Garden podium and like said some of the things I was saying, like what kind of change that could potentially bring about. And then that's why we very much emphasize this notion of telling the truth about the situation. Any guesses as to where this photograph might be from? You've been here too many times. I'm someone else. You?
Sahara? Some desert?
Any others? That's a pretty natural guess. This is actually the Mississippi River from last November. And that's happening at 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming. At 1.1 degrees Celsius warming, the Mississippi River in the month of November is unnavigable in large parts. So, and what is the consequence of that? Like of these rivers drying out? It's not just the obvious consequence of impact on drinking water or irrigation. There are all kinds of knock-on effects. Like Mississippi River is a very important shipping channel. All the corn from the Midwest goes down to the port through the Mississippi River. It's a very, very cheap and inefficient way of transporting grain. The rivers in Europe were in great trouble this year too, this summer. What are the knock-on effects of that? Nuclear plants could not be cooled. All kinds of factories, they could not get the materials shipped to them. So we live in a very, very complicated, kind of fragile, technology-dependent society. And so with these kind of climate impacts, all those things start disintegrating as well. So there's a notion of carbon budget. So this is an idea of like how much carbon dioxide we are still allowed to emit, right, to remain within that safe 1.5 degree limit. So I think so around 2020, they calculated that the carbon budget was 500 gigatons. We could still emit 500 gigatons, and we would still be at a safe level. But what happened, like little later, the science got a little more refined, and then they observed like how much emissions were actually like going up. And then they said, no, maybe as of the beginning of 2023, we do not have a 500 gigaton carbon budget. Yeah, maybe we have a 380 gigaton carbon budget. And then the science got refined further, and they made actual observations of greenhouse gas emissions. And then they noticed that the carbon budget was actually probably even a little lower, 260 gigatons. And contrast all these refining of estimates, all this uncertainty of estimates, with how much emissions we actually have in the pipeline from oil, coal, and gas projects that are already in production or about to be in production, because they are in the pipeline. Investors have already put their money in that. So if all of those oil, coal, and gas were actually burnt up, we would be emitting 780 gigatons, way beyond any of these estimates of carbon budget. And understand all the uncertainties in these, because human economics is fairly complicated. It's like very difficult to make exact predictions. And the climate science is also fairly complicated. So when we have all these uncertainties, on which side should we be erring? Should we be erring on the side of emitting too much or emitting too little? Because on the side of emitting too much is extinction. On the side of emitting too little, maybe a Hawaii vacation not taken, right? So that brings us to our second demand, that we should halt biodiversity loss and greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. Because that is the science-based demand, not based on all kinds of political compromises and a whole bunch of politicians getting together in a room and deciding what is plausible. Because physics doesn't care of plausibility of human systems. You cannot go to physics and argue, water takes one joule to heat up 1 degree Celsius for 1 gram. That's like not working for us. Can we make it like a 0.5 joules? That doesn't work, right? We can change our systems. We cannot argue with physics. So what we really need at this point is an emergency mobilization. Imagine what happened. Try to think what happened during the Second World War. Once Pearl Harbor happened, things completely changed. Politicians stopped squabbling amongst each other. Things that were unthinkable before became possible. The government went to private factories and told them, hey, you can't make cars anymore. You have to make tanks and planes, right? Tax rates went up. Rationing was imposed. Women went to work in large numbers. All these societal changes that were unthinkable before became possible because an emergency was recognized and the emergency mobilization happened. And this was an illustration of what kind of emergency we are in. This is from Pakistan last year. Like a third of the country was underwater. And what did Pakistan do to deserve this fate? If you look out the historical greenhouse gas emissions of every country. It's important to look at historical emissions, like from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and not just today, because all that carbon dioxide from 200 years ago is still up in the air and heating our atmosphere and heating our Earth. If you look at that list of historical emissions, you won't even find Pakistan on the list. It's so way far below. And the United States is like way at the top. And if you consider the populations of Pakistan and the United States, then per capita emissions, the situation is even more stark. Not just Pakistan. This is Hurricane Ian from Florida. This is a trailer park that basically ceased to exist from one day to another. This is Hurricane Ida from the previous year in Queens. People died in flooded basements. So the important point is, it's all around the world we see, it's the people who are most vulnerable. The poorest people who consume the least, they are the most impacted by climate change. So that brings us to our fourth demand. I'll talk about the third demand in a little bit. That's a demand for a just transition. That we transition away from this fossil fuel-based economy to an economy that uses renewables in a way that takes care of the most vulnerable, the people who are most historically harmed. Because we see in the United States, politicians and even some climate activists telling people that the American way of life of single-family houses and suburban sprawl and two-car garages, all that will continue. You can continue all of that, just switch out the energy source from fossil fuel to renewables. But that is not true. All that would do is to switch away one form of extraction of one set of materials to a different set of materials. We already have child labor in Congo for mining cobalt for batteries. We already have Elon Musk threatening a coup in Bolivia for the purpose of lithium, for getting lithium. The mining laws in the United States have not changed for 100 years. And a lot of those mines are in indigenous territories where indigenous people still live. So that's why we focus on this, that the transition should happen in a way that protects the historically harmed and does not perpetuate the kind of injustices that we have already seen over the last 200 years. Any guesses as to where this photograph may be from? Ireland. Everyone knows the Irish flag. Any guesses what might be the occasion? Yes. So what happened was in 2018, in Ireland, they repealed a close to 40-year-old amendment to their constitution that almost absolutely criminalized abortion. And what happened in 2018 is that they were able to overturn this. But how were they able to do this? Like, abortion is like such a third-rail issue in a heavily Catholic country like Ireland. Like, how did this come about? This came about because they took up a process known as citizens' assembly. So a citizens' assembly is like a jury system, but for policy. So what you do is like you make a random collection of people that represent your population, a random but representative population. So if like half the people in your society are below poverty level, so 50 people in that collection should be below poverty level. If 25% are people of color, then 25% in the collection should be people of color. So this way you build a random but representative collection of your society. And then for whatever the issue might be, in this particular case it was abortion, you bring scientists and policymakers, experts, to talk to these people. Like it would happen in an ideal courthouse. We don't know. We know ideal courthouses don't at all exist. So we get experts to talk on all sides of the issue to these people. And then the Citizens' Assembly deliberates on the issue and then issues recommendation. And this is what happened in Ireland. There was a Citizens' Assembly on this issue. And the media followed it. And these discussions were followed along by people. So you see, it did not become the typical, the 30-second soundbite on TV kind of situation. So there was a deliberative process that the society followed along, and that's why this change happened. Because, and what's interesting is that it's often politicians are often actually interested that this kind of a process be followed, because politicians, they basically, they want to remain politicians. They want to stay employed. They don't want to touch those difficult issues that might, get them thrown out of office. So if they can take difficult issues off their hands and put them in a citizens' assembly, that's often actually favored by them. And the experiment is, so in Ireland it was successful. France had a very big citizens' assembly for climate. That was pretty successful. And it's actually starting in New York City as well. So certain participatory budgeting processes are being accomplished through citizens' assembly in certain city councils. So that is our third demand. So we recognize that the science tells us where we need to be, what the end state is, what kind of emission cuts we need to do. But there are many paths to getting there, right? So, and those paths will have competing interests. So we create a citizens' assembly to kind of decide on the path of getting to that net zero reduced emission scenario. So that's our third demand. So how do we get society and government to accept these demands? Our method is nonviolent direct action, also called civil disobedience. It has been practiced for a while in history. It was probably pioneered by Gandhi in South Africa, actually. I was about to say India, but it was probably pioneered by Gandhi in South Africa. So it has a history of success, and that's Martin Luther King, and that's from the AIDS epidemic in the United States in the 80s, where people who are actually dying of AIDS use civil disobedience to kind of shake the government out of its apathy of not investing in resources to address the crisis. So that's basically our primary mechanism. It doesn't mean we are always doing civil disobedience. It doesn't mean we are always breaking the law. In fact, we'll have a very colorful action coming up on Valentine's Day, which will be completely legal. But civil disobedience is a very, very important tool in our arsenal. And for every, we like to say, for every person who gets arrested, there's like 10 people behind that person, supporting that person in various ways. So even if you are not in a position to be arrested yourself, and a lot of people are not, there is definitely a place for you in Extinction Rebellion. So that's basically our call to you. Join the movement. We have needs for all kinds of people, people with all kinds of skills. Sometimes we have needs for very specific skills. Right now, I believe we definitely need people with some IT skills. But what I'd like to tell people is that, when you come to a climate movement, don't come with the expectation that you will be able to use what you do in your day job in the climate movement. That will not necessarily be the case. What is most important that you bring yourself, you bring your time, and you bring your body to the movement. You do not necessarily have to bring any expertise. Like a lot of people from the finance industry, they come in and say, oh, I can use my finance expertise. Actually, the climate movement has enough finance expertise. Like that stuff is kind of known, that we don't need to be investing in fossil fuels anymore. So what's most important is that you come and give your time and your presence to the movement. These are some very good basic starting points that you go to our website and look up what events we have. And also there are ways of that you can talk one-on-one to a person with your questions. You can schedule a call. That's another great way of getting into the movement. Any questions I can answer?